the 17th of January 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The air tastes of salt and rot. Dawn breaks over the jungle canopy with a light so harsh it seems to burn through the leaves themselves. A Japanese reconnaissance officer crouches in the undergrowth at the edge of what was, 3 weeks ago, an impenetrable wall of tropical forest. His uniform clings to his skin, damp with the humidity that never leaves this cursed island. Through his field glasses, he watches something that defies everything he was taught about warfare, about patience, about the natural order of conquest. Where dense jungle stood, where his own engineers had calculated it would take months, perhaps a full year to clear there, now stretches a ribbon of coral and crushed stone, flat and wide and impossibly straight. American aircraft, sleek and numerous, touch down with casual regularity. The engines roar, the dust rises, and the officer lowers his binoculars with hands that tremble not from fear, but from the collapse of understanding itself. This is not how war is supposed to unfold. The doctrine of patient conquest. For generations, Japanese military doctrine had been built upon principles refined through centuries of island warfare and continental campaigning. The art of fortification, the virtue of entrenchment, the belief that territory, once taken, must be held through meticulous preparation and iron will. When Japanese forces swept across the Pacific in the opening months of 1942, they did so with a confidence born from recent triumph and historical precedent. They had seen the British surrender Singapore. They had watched the Americans retreat from the Philippines. They had learned, through victory after victory, that warfare in the Pacific was a matter of seizing strongpoints and making them impregnable. The logic was sound. An island fortress, properly supplied and defended, could hold out indefinitely. Distance itself became a weapon. The vast stretches of ocean between supply points meant that any attacking force would arrive exhausted, undersupplied, stretched thin across thousands of miles of hostile sea. The jungle, too, was an ally thick, disease-ridden, impassable. It took months to carve roads through such terrain. It took years to build the infrastructure necessary for sustained military operations, or so they believed. Japanese military planners, studying the American character through the lens of their own cultural assumptions, had calculated that the soft, comfort-loving Americans would lack the discipline for jungle warfare. They would lack the patience for the slow, grinding work of logistics. They would arrive with their machines and their wealth, yes, but machines broke down in the tropics. Wealth meant nothing when supply lines stretched across an ocean and submarines prowled beneath the waves. The Americans, they reasoned, would take an island and then pause weeks, perhaps months, to consolidate, to build their bases with the methodical slowness that such work demanded. This was the fatal miscalculation. The engineers arrive. When the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in August 1942, they came not merely as riflemen, but as the vanguard of something the Japanese had never encountered. Industrial warfare at oceanic scale. Behind the Marines came the engineers, the Seabees, the construction battalions. Men whose warfare was measured not in yards gained but in cubic yards moved, not in enemies killed but in runways completed, fuel depots established, hospitals erected from nothing but determination and American industrial might. The Japanese had begun construction of an airfield at Lunga Point. It was strategic, positioned to dominate the sea lanes and threaten the supply routes to Australia. Their engineers had worked for months, clearing jungle by hand, levelling ground with patience and sweat. It was perhaps 60% complete when the Marines landed. The Japanese soldiers, retreating into the jungle, assumed this was merely a temporary setback. The Americans would occupy the position, yes, but they would not be able to complete the airfield quickly. They would not be able to make it operational. They would certainly not be able to expand it, to turn it into a major base capable of supporting heavy bomber operations. Within days, they realized how wrong they were. The Marines secured the perimeter, and then the engineers descended upon that unfinished airfield like a force of nature. They brought with them machines that seemed to have stepped from some future war bulldozers that could clear in hours what took Japanese work gangs days, graders that smoothed earth with mechanical precision, rollers that compacted coral runways until they could bear the weight of the heaviest bombers. But more than machines, they brought an approach to warfare that was fundamentally alien to Japanese military thinking. American engineer battalions operated with an urgency that bordered on the fanatical, yet their methods were pure industrial efficiency. Work proceeded around the clock. Crews rotated in shifts so that the sound of engines never ceased, day or night. When one bulldozer broke down, another immediately took its place, not because there was a massive surplus sitting idle, but because American logistics had calculated the breakdown rate and pre-positioned replacements accordingly. When coral aggregate ran low, survey teams had already identified the next quarry site. When fuel stocks dwindled, tanker trucks arrived as if summoned by prophecy rather than radio. 12 days after the landing, the first American aircraft touched down on what was now Henderson Field. 12 days. The Japanese commanders, observing from the jungle, sent urgent reports back to Rabaul that were initially dismissed as exaggeration or panic. 12 days to complete an airfield in the middle of hostile jungle? Impossible. But the reconnaissance photographs did not lie. The American aircraft were real. The runway was operational, and it was growing longer every day. The symphony of construction. There was a rhythm to American construction that the Japanese reconnaissance teams came to recognize with a kind of horrified fascination. It began before dawn, with the cough and rumble of diesel engines warming up in the darkness. Then came the mechanical symphony, the deep growl of bulldozers, the higher whine of graders, the pneumatic stutter of jackhammers breaking coral. To American ears, it was simply the sound of work. To the Japanese soldiers hiding in the jungle, subsisting on dwindling rice rations and fighting malaria, it was something else entirely. It was the sound of enemy abundance, the sound of a nation so wealthy it could ship entire factories across an ocean and reassemble them on a hostile shore. The scale was incomprehensible. While Japanese engineers operated with tools and techniques refined over centuries, hand tools, animal labor, the slow accumulation of earthworks, the Americans brought mechanized might that rewrote the rules of what was possible. A single American bulldozer could move more earth in an hour than a company of Japanese soldiers could shift in a week. But it was not merely the machines that astonished. It was the system behind them. Every bulldozer had fuel. Every dump truck had spare parts. Every work crew had rations, not meager portions of rice and dried fish, but calories in abundance. The Japanese soldiers, watching from concealment, saw American engineers pause for meal breaks and consume food in quantities that seemed obscene. Canned meat, fresh bread, coffee in unlimited supply. There were even rumors, passed along the Japanese communication networks with the quality of ghost stories, of American facilities that included ice cream machines and Coca-Cola dispensaries. This was not merely inequality of supply. This was warfare transformed into industrial production, where the output was not manufactured goods but strategic capability itself. The equation of time. In Tokyo, staff officers studied the reports from Guadalcanal with growing alarm. The numbers did not make sense. Japanese engineering doctrine held that airfield construction required a minimum of 3 months in favorable conditions, and the Solomon Islands were anything but favorable. The jungle was classified as Class 4 terrain, the most difficult category. The humidity caused machinery to rust and fail. The diseases, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, could reduce a workforce by half within weeks. The Americans should have been bogged down, struggling, vulnerable. Instead, Henderson Field expanded. By September, it was handling dozens of flights per day. By October, it had been supplemented by Fighter Strip 1, carved from jungle that had been impenetrable forest only weeks before. By November, a second parallel runway was under construction, and the complex had grown to include fuel storage for thousands of gallons, ammunition dumps, repair facilities, and a field hospital that would have been the envy of many stateside installations. The Japanese launched counterattack after counterattack, trying to reclaim what they now realized was the key to the entire Guadalcanal campaign. They sent warships to bombard the airfield by night. They sent soldiers through the jungle to assault the perimeter. They sent aircraft to crater the runways and destroy the parked planes. Some attacks succeeded temporarily. Shells would tear up sections of runway. Bombing raids would destroy fuel dumps. Infiltration teams would damage parked aircraft. But by morning, the engineers were already at work. Craters were filled. Fuel was replaced from reserve stocks. Damaged aircraft were either repaired or pushed aside to clear space for reinforcements. The Japanese threw resources at the problem with increasing desperation, and each time they succeeded in temporarily disrupting operations, the Americans simply rebuilt faster than Tokyo could calculate the disruption should take. It was like fighting an opponent who refused to acknowledge being wounded, who absorbed every blow and continued advancing as if invulnerable. The mathematics of warfare had changed, but only one side understood the new equation. Voices from the jungle. Lieutenant Kenji Suzuki, Imperial Japanese Army, kept a diary that would later be recovered from his body after a failed assault on Henderson Field's perimeter. His entries trace the psychological journey from confidence to bewilderment to despair. In early August, he writes with optimism about the American landing, calling it premature, and predicting that supply difficulties will force a withdrawal within weeks. By mid-September, his tone has changed. He describes watching, through field glasses, as American engineers work through the night under floodlights powered by portable generators. They have turned night into day, he writes. How can we fight an enemy who does not sleep? By October, hunger and sickness have begun to dominate his entries. The supplies promised by headquarters have not arrived. The American aircraft operating from Henderson have made daytime naval operations suicidal, and the nighttime rat run of fast destroyers can deliver only a fraction of what the Japanese garrison needs. Meanwhile, he can see the Americans receiving supply drops, cargo planes landing with food and ammunition, engineering equipment being unloaded from transport vessels that somehow navigate through waters the Japanese still nominally control. His final entries are philosophical, almost resigned. We were told the Americans were soft, he writes. We were told they lacked fighting spirit, that they valued comfort over sacrifice. But I watch them build, day after day, in heat that prostrates our own men. They build through our bombardments. They build through our air raids. They build as if construction itself is a kind of warfare, and they are determined to outbuild us into submission. Perhaps this is the true American way of war, not to outfight the enemy, but to outproduce him until resistance becomes mathematically impossible. He was killed 3 days later in a nighttime assault that briefly penetrated Henderson's perimeter before being driven back. The attack destroyed several aircraft and damaged a fuel dump. By noon the next day, repair crews had restored operational capacity. The bullet-riddled notebook was found in his pocket and eventually made its way to American intelligence, where analysts read his words with a mixture of respect and grim satisfaction. The machinery of abundance. What the Japanese observers could not fully comprehend was that the airfield construction they witnessed was merely the visible manifestation of a supply chain that stretched back across the Pacific to the industrial heartland, America. Every bulldozer blade, every drum of fuel, every bag of concrete, every welding rod had been manufactured in factories in Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh cities whose industrial output alone exceeded the manufacturing capacity of the entire Japanese empire. These materials had been loaded onto ships in San Francisco and Pearl Harbor, convoyed across submarine-infested waters, and delivered to Guadalcanal with a regularity that Japanese planners had calculated was impossible. But the Americans had cracked the code of oceanic logistics through sheer abundance of resources. They built ships faster than submarines could sink them. They manufactured spare parts in such quantities that equipment rarely sat idle for lack of replacement components. They established supply depots at intermediate points, Noumea, Espiritu Santo, that functioned as forward warehouses, buffering the construction sites from the inevitable disruptions of long-distance supply. The Seabees themselves embodied this philosophy. Unlike traditional military engineers who were soldiers trained in construction, The Seabees were construction workers given military rank. They were men who, in civilian life, had built highways and dams and skyscrapers. They understood schedules and critical path analysis and resource optimization. They brought to warfare the mindset of American commercial construction, the conviction that any project, no matter how challenging, was simply a problem of sufficient resources properly organized, and they were authorized to innovate. When traditional construction materials were unavailable, they improvised. Coral aggregate replaced concrete where necessary. Pierced steel planking interlocking metal plates that could be laid down like a giant jigsaw puzzle created runways in a fraction of the time required for poured concrete. Local materials were assessed and utilized. The rigid military hierarchies that might have slowed decision-making were flattened in the face of operational necessity. A lieutenant could authorize changes to construction plans if it meant completing the job faster. A sergeant could requisition supplies without navigating a maze of approval chains. This flexibility horrified Japanese observers almost as much as the abundance itself. The Japanese military structure was built on rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience to central planning. The idea that junior officers might alter plans based on field conditions was nearly unthinkable. Yet the Americans did it constantly, and it worked. Projects that should have failed due to unforeseen obstacles instead adapted and succeeded, often ahead of schedule. The expanding frontier. Henderson Field was only the beginning. As 1942 gave way to 1943, the pattern established at Guadalcanal repeated itself across the Pacific with variations, but with the same fundamental theme. American forces would seize an island, and within weeks, sometimes just days, engineers would carve from jungle or coral an airfield capable of supporting the next offensive. Munda Point in New Georgia, Piva Yoke on Bougainville, Momote on Los Negros. Each base built faster than the last as techniques were refined and experience accumulated. The Japanese developed a fatalistic terminology for this phenomenon. They called it kensetsu senso, construction warfare. It was warfare they had no answer for because it was predicated on resources they could not match. Japan's industrial base, stretched across occupied territories and struggling with raw material shortages, could not produce the machines or the supplies at anything approaching the American rate. Japanese engineers, skilled and dedicated though they were, operated with tools and methods that belonged to an earlier era of warfare. The contrast was stark. While American Seabees arrived with full complements of mechanized equipment, Japanese engineers often had to make do with hand tools and impressed local labor. While Americans bulldozed jungle and crushed coral with diesel-powered efficiency, Japanese work parties cleared vegetation with machetes and axes. While American bases grew with geometric precision, expanding in carefully planned phases, Japanese positions were built slowly, laboriously, always struggling to keep pace with operational demands. At Munda Point, Japanese defenders watched as American forces landed on nearby islands and began construction of artillery positions and supply depots. The Japanese had spent months fortifying Munda, building bunkers and revetments, preparing for the assault. When it came, they fought with characteristic ferocity. But even as the battle raged, American engineers were already at work on the islands already secured, preparing the infrastructure for the next leap forward. The Japanese commander at Munda, General Noboru Sasaki, sent a message to headquarters that captured the essential futility. "We can kill American soldiers, but we cannot kill American productivity." The coral runways. There was something almost mythological about the coral runways that began to appear across the Pacific Islands. Coral, crushed and compacted, created a surface that could bear enormous weight, while remaining permeable enough to drain the tropical rains that would have turned dirt runways into impassable mud. It was a material perfectly suited to the Pacific theater, and the Americans exploited it with characteristic thoroughness. Japanese reconnaissance teams would report watching American engineers identify coral deposits, establish quarries, and begin extraction all within the same day as an island's capture. The coral would be crushed on site using mobile equipment, mixed with binding agents, spread across the runway bed, and compacted using heavy rollers. Within a week, a serviceable runway would emerge. Within 2 weeks, it would be handling heavy bomber traffic. The Japanese had used coral in their own construction projects, but never with such speed or at such scale. American engineers seemed to treat entire islands as construction sites, reshaping geography to suit operational needs. Hills were leveled, swamps were filled, coastlines were modified to create harbors and seaplane ramps. It was engineering warfare conducted with the confidence of a nation that saw nature itself as merely another obstacle to be overcome through applied technology and labor. To the Japanese soldiers, starving in the jungle, watching this transformation through field glasses, it must have seemed like watching gods remake the world. The noise alone was a weapon. The constant growl of engines, the crash of falling trees, the grinding of earth-moving equipment. It was a 24-hour reminder of American presence and American power. Some Japanese defenders reported that the sound invaded their dreams, that even when they managed to sleep, they heard phantom bulldozers in the darkness. The human cost of industrial warfare. But the runways and bases came at a price, though it was a price the Americans were willing and able to pay. The Seabees worked in conditions that killed. The tropical diseases showed no mercy. Malaria struck down construction workers as readily as combat troops. Heat exhaustion was endemic. Accidents with heavy machinery in jungle conditions killed and maimed. Yet for every man who fell sick or was injured, another stepped up. The replacement pipeline never ran dry. This, too, was a kind of abundance that the Japanese could not match. When Japanese soldiers fell ill, they often remained at their posts because there were no replacements. When American engineers were hospitalized with malaria, fresh personnel arrived on the next transport. The American military system had calculated attrition rates, disease, injury, combat losses, and built those calculations into manning levels and replacement schedules. It was warfare as actuarial science, warfare as industrial process optimization. The Japanese watched men land at Guadalcanal looking healthy and strong, work for weeks in brutal conditions, rotate out as they sickened, and be replaced by new arrivals who looked just as healthy and strong. It seemed infinite. It seemed impossible. And it was deeply, profoundly demoralizing. In Tokyo, military planners struggled to develop countermeasures. They couldn't outbuild the Americans, that was clear. Could they disrupt American construction through continuous harassment? The attempts were made. Night bombardments, air raids, infiltration attacks targeting engineer units, but the Americans adapted. Anti-aircraft defenses were prioritized at construction sites. Engineer battalions were given infantry training and integrated into perimeter defenses. Work proceeded under fire, under bombardment, under conditions that would have halted Japanese construction efforts entirely. The turning point of understanding. By mid-1943, perceptive Japanese officers began to understand that Guadalcanal represented not merely a tactical defeat, but a revelation of strategic reality. The war, they now realized, would not be decided by fighting spirit or tactical brilliance. It would be decided by industrial capacity and logistical reach, and in those measures, the gap between American and Japanese capabilities was not merely significant, it was potentially insurmountable. Some officers began to advocate for a negotiated peace, arguing that continuing the war against an enemy who could build airfields in weeks and replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them was madness. These voices were silenced or ignored. The war would continue for 2 more years, each battle revealing anew the fundamental asymmetry that Guadalcanal had made visible. But among the troops on the front lines, the lesson had been learned. Japanese veterans who had witnessed American construction operations spoke of them with a kind of awe. They had been taught that Americans were weak, materialistic, lacking in spiritual strength. But what they saw was a different kind of strength, the strength of organized labor, of industrial might, of a society that could mobilize its productive capacity and project it across an ocean to reshape hostile islands into forward bases. One captured Japanese officer, interrogated after the fall of the Solomon Islands, tried to explain to his American questioners what it had been like. "We knew you had more ships, more planes, more tanks," he said through an interpreter. "We knew your factories produced more, But we thought there would be friction, inefficiency, delay. We thought the distance would protect us, that the ocean would be our moat. We never imagined you could simply build faster than we could destroy. Build as if the jungle was not there, as if the distance meant nothing. You Americans fight with bulldozers and concrete mixers the way we fight with rifles and swords, and we have no defense against it. The legacy, etched in coral. Today, if you travel to Guadalcanal, you can still see the remnants of Henderson Field. The jungle has reclaimed much of it, but the coral runways remain, visible from the air as geometric scars in the vegetation. They are monuments, in their way not to the battles fought, though those were real and costly, but to the transformation in warfare that they represented. The Pacific War would be won by many factors: naval battles and island assaults, submarine warfare, and strategic bombing, code-breaking, and tactical innovation. But underlying all of it was the fundamental reality that Guadalcanal made visible. The side that could build faster, supply more reliably, and replace losses more quickly would prevail. The Japanese had planned for a war of positions and willpower. The Americans brought a war of production and logistics. The engineers who carved Henderson Field from the jungle in those desperate weeks of 1943 were not thinking in such grand terms. They were thinking about tons of coral to be moved, about fuel consumption rates and machinery maintenance schedules, about completing the mission before the next Japanese counterattack. But in their work, unglamorous, unsung, compared to the heroics of infantry combat, they forged the instrument of Allied victory. There is a photograph, taken in late 1943, that captures something essential about this transformation. It shows Henderson Field at the height of its operation. In the foreground, a work crew is repairing bomb damage from the previous night's raid. In the middle ground, aircraft are landing and taking off, a steady stream of them. In the background, jungle rises like a wall, dark and impenetrable. And yet it has been pushed back, held at bay by human will and American industrial might. A Japanese officer's diary, recovered from Guadalcanal, contains a final entry dated November 1943, just before his unit's evacuation from the island. He writes, "We came to these islands as conquerors, and we believed the jungle would be our ally. But the Americans have conquered the jungle itself. They have made the impossible routine. I do not know how to fight an enemy who treats geography as a suggestion rather than a law. We were taught that spirit conquers matter. But I have seen matter, American machines, American abundance crush spirit, until nothing remains but the acknowledgement of defeat, the sound that never stopped. In the end, what defeated Japanese forces at Guadalcanal and across the Pacific was not superior tactics or better soldiers, though the Americans had both in adequate supply. It was the sound that never stopped, the sound of engines in the darkness, the sound of construction proceeding through air raids and artillery barrages, the sound of a nation that had turned its entire productive capacity toward victory and would not be denied. The Japanese had expected Americans to fight like Europeans, with pauses for consolidation and careful preparation. Instead, they encountered something unprecedented: industrial warfare at its purest, where the factory and the battlefield merged into one continuous process of production and destruction, where every captured island immediately became a forward base for the next assault, where the rhythm of construction never broke regardless of enemy action. This was the lesson written in coral across 1,000 Pacific islands. This was the truth that Japanese reconnaissance officers carried back to their superiors, though it was a truth many refused to believe until the very end. Warfare had changed. The side that could outproduce its enemy, that could turn industrial abundance into strategic mobility, that could compress months of construction into weeks and days, that side would win, regardless of tactical setbacks or temporary defeats. The American engineers who built Henderson Field in those 12 impossible days did not know they were demonstrating a new form of warfare. They were simply doing their jobs, applying American industrial methods to military problems, trusting in their machines and their logistics and their training. But in doing so, they proved something that would echo through the remaining years of the war and beyond. that abundance, properly organized and relentlessly applied, was itself a weapon against which no amount of courage or fortification could prevail. And in the jungle, in the darkness between the floodlit construction zones, Japanese soldiers heard the bulldozers growling through another night, and they understood, though understanding changed nothing, that they were fighting not just an enemy army, but an entire civilization's industrial might, unleashed and unstoppable.